You think she wants more time, more effort, more rounds. You were trained to believe that if she enjoyed it once, she'll want it again and again and again. That desire is something you can stack, repeat, multiply. So you push forward, you stay longer, you try harder, convinced that persistence equals passion. And at first, it feels logical, masculine, efficient. But here's where everything quietly breaks. Every time you chase quantity, her desire doesn't grow, it thins. It slips away without a sound. Not because you did something wrong on the surface, but because you misunderstood what she was ever responding to in the first place. She was never wired to crave repetition the way you are. She wasn't chasing more moments. She was chasing a specific internal shift, and once that feeling disappears, no amount of frequency can bring it back. This is the part most men never see. While you're counting time, she's tracking a sensation. While you're focused on continuation, her nervous system is deciding whether it wants to enter that state again. And the moment she feels you trying to extract more instead of create that feeling, something inside her closes. Subtly, instantly. You mistake her withdrawal for fatigue, for mood, for randomness. But it isn't random. It's precise. Because what she's craving has nothing to do with repetition, and everything to do with how she feels inside herself when she's with you. The confusion you feel right now, that gap between what you expect and what actually happens, isn't failure. It's the first crack in a myth you've been living inside. And once that crack opens, tension follows. Because if desire isn't built on more, then the question becomes dangerous. What is it actually built on? The lie most men live by is simple, clean, and completely wrong. If she enjoyed it, she'll want it again, and again, and again. You assume desire works like momentum, that once it starts, it naturally carries forward. That pleasure automatically creates appetite. This belief feels intuitive because it mirrors how your arousal works. When you like something, you want more of it. When something feels good, repetition feels logical. So you apply that operating system to her and expect the same result. But female desire doesn't run on repetition. It runs on state. And the moment you confuse the two, anticipation dies quietly in the background. Here's the difference no one explained to you. Male arousal is like hunger. It's direct, physical, triggered by availability. You see, you want, you act. Simple loop. Female arousal is nothing like that. It's an atmosphere, a psychological climate she steps into. It requires conditions, tension, emotional elevation, a sense that something is unfolding rather than being repeated. When those conditions exist, desire ignites. When they don't, no amount of physical access can revive it. This is why repetition without emotional elevation doesn't build desire, it drains it. Each repeated moment without a rising internal state lowers the emotional temperature instead of increasing it. And when that temperature drops, physical availability becomes meaningless. You can be right there, willing, present, technically available, and she can feel nothing. Because her desire was never attached to the act itself. It was attached to how the act made her feel about herself. When that feeling fades, what remains feels flat, expected, and oddly heavy. This is the moment men misread the situation completely. They push for continuation, thinking consistency will reignite the spark. But to her nervous system, that pressure signals predictability, and predictability kills polarity. Without polarity, there is no pull, only obligation. This is where the real insight cuts deep. She doesn't crave more contact. She craves a shift in identity. She wants to feel different inside herself than she did 5 minutes ago. More alive, less controlled, less self-aware. When that shift happens, desire feels effortless. When it doesn't, repetition feels like work. And the tragedy is that most men never realize they're chasing the wrong variable. They chase frequency, believing it equals desire, while the very thing she needs, the emotional elevation that creates the state, slowly disappears. What she is actually chasing was never the act itself. It was the disappearance of the voice in her head, the moment where she stops watching herself from the outside, the moment where she no longer feels like a role she has to maintain. That sensation has a name, but men rarely understand it because it doesn't show up as excitement or eagerness. It shows up as loss of self-awareness. And when that disappears, desire follows naturally. When it doesn't, nothing else matters. The first layer is psychological surrender. This is where most men fail without realizing it. She stops monitoring her expressions, her reactions, her timing. There is no internal commentary asking if she looks right, sounds right, or is responding the correct way. No self-judgment, no performance. The moment she feels observed, evaluated, or subtly managed, that surrender collapses. She becomes aware again. And awareness is the enemy of desire. This is why trying harder often backfires. Effort draws attention. Attention pulls her back into her head. The second layer is emotional intensity, and this is where attraction becomes personal. She needs to feel chosen, not chased, desired, not handled. There is a difference. Chasing places pressure on her. Being chosen gives her gravity. When she feels managed, she feels like an outcome. When she feels chosen, she feels singular. This distinction changes everything. Desire doesn't grow when she feels pursued. It deepens when she feels pulled, when she senses certainty rather than need, intention rather than hunger. That emotional intensity creates a quiet gravity that keeps her inside the experience instead of questioning it. The third layer is temporal distortion. Time softens, the future disappears. She isn't thinking about what comes next, what this means, or how it ends. There is no after in her mind. This is the state repetition destroys. Because repetition brings expectation. Expectation brings structure. Structure brings time back into focus. And once time returns, so does control. The spell breaks. This is why the crucial line matters. When she says she's tired, it's not her body talking. It's her mind refusing to enter that state again. Not because she didn't enjoy it, but because something about the way it unfolded pulled her back into herself. And once that happens, no amount of frequency can reopen the door. What turns desire against itself is the instinct you trust the most. The instinct to continue, to extend, to capitalize on momentum. You feel something working, so you push for more, assuming continuity will deepen the experience. But for her nervous system, more doesn't signal passion. It signals predictability. And predictability quietly erodes the very tension that made the moment alive. This is the paradox most men never see. The harder you lean into continuation, the faster polarity dissolves. Repetition tells her system that the pattern has been solved. There is nothing left to lean into, nothing left to anticipate, and anticipation is the fuel. Without it, the emotional charge drains out of the moment. Polarity requires contrast between stillness and movement, between presence and absence, between certainty and mystery. Repetition flattens those contrasts. It turns something that felt alive into something that feels scheduled, familiar, expected. Once that happens, desire doesn't escalate. It regulates downward. This is why pushing for continuation keeps her nervous system alert instead of relaxed. Alertness is not arousal. Alertness is control. When she feels the unspoken expectation to respond again, to stay engaged, to keep the loop going, her system doesn't soften, it braces. Bracing pulls her back into awareness. Awareness brings monitoring. Monitoring kills surrender. And when surrender disappears, dryness follows not physically, but psychologically. The experience loses depth because she can't disappear inside it anymore. Most men misunderstand this moment. They sense her pulling back and assume the solution is reassurance, persistence, or effort. But effort only confirms the expectation she's already reacting against. The more you signal this needs to continue, the more her system prepares to manage it rather than melt into it. That preparation feels subtle, but it's decisive. Because the moment she feels expected to respond, the door closes. Not dramatically, not angrily, quietly. What makes this dangerous is how invisible it looks from the outside. She may still be there, still present, still agreeable, but internally, the polarity is gone. The edge that made the experience intoxicating has been replaced by structure, and structure is the enemy of desire. Desire doesn't live in repetition. It lives in contrast. It lives in the space where something could end, where nothing is demanded, where continuation is not assumed, but earned by the state itself. This is where male instinct betrays itself. You chase more, thinking it will amplify what you felt. In reality, you're removing the very uncertainty that allowed her to feel it in the first place. While you're focused on what's happening on the surface, she's quietly running a checklist underneath it all. Not a conscious one, not something she could easily explain if you asked. It's a series of internal filters her nervous system scans before it ever allows her to let go. And if even one of them fails, everything you're trying to build collapses without a clear reason. This is why desire seems inconsistent to men. You're looking for logic. She's responding to states. The first filter is safety, but not the kind most men think. This has nothing to do with comfort or familiarity. It's about whether she feels safe enough to disappear, safe enough to stop managing herself, safe enough to loosen control without feeling exposed or judged. The moment she senses pressure, expectation, or an outcome you're steering toward, that safety vanishes. Her system tightens, not because you did something wrong, but because letting go suddenly feels risky. Desire doesn't survive where vigilance is required. The second filter is whether she feels seen without being analyzed. This is where many men unintentionally sabotage everything. You try to read her, figure her out, adjust in real time. But being analyzed pulls her back into self-awareness. It makes her feel observed instead of experienced. seen. To her doesn't mean noticed. It means felt. When she senses you're tracking reactions instead of holding presence, the moment becomes mechanical. She starts watching herself again. And once she's watching herself, she's no longer inside the experience. The third filter is subtle but decisive. Does she feel pulled or persuaded? Persuasion feels like effort. Effort feels like need. And need flips the polarity, being pulled. On the other hand, feels like gravity. No argument, no convincing, just a quiet inevitability that draws her forward. The difference is everything. Persuasion engages her mind. Being pulled bypasses it. One creates resistance, the other dissolves it. This is why the contrast matters so much. She doesn't want to be handled. She wants to be led into a state. Handling implies control, technique, management. Leading implies direction without force, certainty without pressure. When those filters align, desire doesn't need to be chased or repeated. It unfolds on its own. And when they don't, nothing you add will fix it, because what she's responding to was never the act, but the internal conditions that allowed her to lose herself in it. This is where most men lose the feeling without ever realizing they touched it. Not because they lack desire, but because they interfere with the very state they're trying to create. The collapse rarely comes from one big mistake. It comes from small, well-intentioned moves that pull her back into herself. The first is rushing transitions. Moving too quickly from one moment to the next signals impatience. Impatience signals outcome focus. And the moment she senses you're trying to get somewhere, her system shifts from experiencing to evaluating. She starts tracking what's happening instead of sinking into it. What felt fluid suddenly feels guided. Then comes checking reactions. A glance for confirmation. A subtle pause to see if she's still with you. This seems harmless, even considerate. But psychologically, it does damage. It hands her responsibility for the moment. It asks her to reassure you that what you're doing is working. The second she feels responsible for managing your confidence, the dynamic flips. She's no longer inside the experience. She's supervising it. Desire doesn't survive supervision. Seeking reassurance deepens the problem. Verbal or nonverbal, it doesn't matter. When you look for validation, you turn inward. You become self-aware. And self-awareness is contagious. She mirrors it. Now both of you are thinking instead of feeling. This is why so many moments fade without explanation. Nothing went wrong, but the state dissolved. Talking when silence would deepen intensity is another quiet killer. Words aren't neutral. They pull attention upward. They activate logic. Silence, when held with certainty, does the opposite. It allows sensation to expand. It gives her space to fall inward. When you fill that space unnecessarily, you interrupt the descent. She doesn't resist. She simply stays on the surface. All of these mistakes point back to one principle. Desire collapses when she becomes self-aware. Every action that draws attention to mechanics, outcomes, or your own uncertainty pulls her out of the state she was entering. And here's the anchor most men need to hear, because it cuts against instinct. The more you try to do, the less she can feel. Doing creates noise. Feeling requires quiet. When you understand this, you stop trying to add intensity and start protecting it. You realize your role isn't to stimulate endlessly, but to remove the friction that brings her back into her head. That's where the feeling survives. The shift that changes everything is not about learning new moves. It's about abandoning the mindset that got you here. The moment you stop treating desire like a performance, something recalibrates. Performance keeps you busy. Presence makes you grounded. When you are present, you're no longer trying to generate a reaction. You're holding a state, and states are contagious. This is the reframe most men miss because it feels passive on the surface, yet it's psychologically dominant underneath. Presence replaces performance when you stop measuring yourself in outcomes. You're not tracking whether things are escalating fast enough or landing the way you planned. You're attentive without being reactive, calm without being detached. That calm is what her nervous system responds to. It signals that nothing is being demanded from her, that she's not being rushed toward a finish line. When output disappears as the goal, atmosphere becomes the focus. And atmosphere is where desire actually breathes. Atmosphere is built through pacing, not action. Slow emotional pacing tells her system there is no urgency, no pressure to respond, adjust, or keep up. Urgency forces awareness. Slowness dissolves it. This is why fewer words matter. Words explain. Certainty doesn't need explanation. When you speak less but remain steady, she feels held instead of guided. The space between moments stretches, and inside that space, anticipation grows without effort. Control of pace is where effort finally drops away. Effort is loud. It announces itself. Control is quiet. It's felt, not seen. When you control pace, you decide when moments end, not to withdraw, but to preserve the state before it collapses. Ending moments before they peak isn't restraint. It's intelligence. Peaks resolve tension. Resolution brings relief. And relief is the opposite of desire. Desire lives in suspension. This is where the instinct to continue must be overridden. You don't stay to prove something. You don't push to maximize time. You let the moment remain unfinished. That unfinished quality keeps her system open instead of closing. It keeps the emotional temperature warm instead of cooling. And this is where the line becomes dangerous in its simplicity. Leave her nervous system wanting to stay, not relieved it's over. When you operate from this frame, you're no longer chasing desire or trying to recreate it. You're protecting the conditions that allow it to form. You stop adding stimulation and start removing friction. And in doing so, you create something far more powerful than repetition, a state she wants to return to on her own. At the end of all of this, one truth separates the men she remembers from the men who blur together. It isn't skill, it isn't endurance, it isn't how long the moment lasted or how many times it happened. Those details fade quickly because they were never the point. What stays with her is internal. She doesn't remember what happened. She remembers who she became while it was happening. That shift is what brands itself into memory. Some men leave no imprint because nothing inside her changed. She stayed the same person throughout the experience, aware, guarded, managing herself, tracking time. Even if it was pleasant, it was contained. It ended cleanly. Her system closed and moved on. Other men trigger something different with them. She steps into a version of herself she doesn't access often, less controlled, less edited, less split between thought and sensation. That version of herself feels rare. and rarity is what memory protects. This is why comparison doesn't work the way men think it does. She isn't stacking performances side by side. She's remembering states. She's remembering how quiet her mind felt, how little she cared about the outside world, how time seemed irrelevant. The man associated with that internal shift becomes symbolic, not because he did something extraordinary, but because he allowed something extraordinary to happen inside her. He didn't pull her forward. He removed what held her back. That's also why trying to be unforgettable usually fails. Effort anchors the experience to the man. Presence anchors it to the feeling. When the feeling becomes the focus, she associates it with freedom rather than obligation, with expansion rather than depletion. And the nervous system doesn't forget states that feel expansive. It seeks them out again, instinctively, without needing to be convinced. This is the final reversal most men need to absorb. Desire isn't stored in the body. It's stored in identity. She remembers the moments where she lost herself, not because they were intense, but because they were unmeasured. No clock, no pressure, no outcome, just a suspension of self-awareness that felt natural and unforced. That's why repetition never creates what men hope it will. You can't repeat a loss of time. You can only recreate the conditions that allow it. So let this settle without rushing past it. Women don't want more times. They want the feeling that makes them lose time. If you've been listening closely, you can feel the shift already. Not excitement, not urgency, something quieter. A recalibration. The realization that desire was never something you were supposed to chase, earn, or extract through effort. It was something that emerged when the conditions were right and collapsed the moment you tried to force it. That understanding changes how you move. You stop filling silence with action. You stop measuring moments by output. You stop mistaking availability for attraction. What replaces it is restraint, but not weakness. Precision. You become selective with your energy, deliberate with your pacing, comfortable with leaving things unresolved. Not because you're withholding, but because you finally understand what sustains the feeling. You no longer rush to extend moments that are alive. You protect them by ending them cleanly, before they turn into something predictable. That discipline is felt. It registers long after you're gone. This is where identity shifts. You're no longer the man trying to be remembered. You become the man associated with a state she can't manufacture on her own. Calm without detachment, certainty without pressure, presence without demand. Those qualities don't announce themselves, but they reorganize everything around them. They make desire feel voluntary again, unforced, internal. Let this settle instead of turning it into a tactic, because once you see it clearly, you can't unsee it. And when you understand this, you stop chasing desire and start creating the state it needs to exist.